Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirant. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
All right. So, on this time's episode of the Disrupt Your Career podcast, I am really happy to be welcoming Sarah Wittman. Sarah has a bachelor's in business, marketing and strategy from a university in Canada, a master's in political communication from Spain, and a PhD in organizational behaviour from INSEAD in France and, of course, the world. She's now an assistant professor in management at the George Mason University in Washington, D.C. Her work explores people's transitions within, across, and beyond organizational boundaries, the organizational impacts of these transitions, and the social, technological, and learning support systems that can help make these comings and goings more personally and organizationally successful. Sarah, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's exciting to be here.
Wonderful. Good. Well, let's start as we always do with your career journey. You've got these degrees in somewhat eclectic subjects, and you've dipped into the world of business beyond academia a few times, but you seem to be a stalwart academic at heart. You've also moved country and continent more than most. So why don't you share with us how your career has unfolded? Tell us about the relative importance of design and serendipity in the way it's played out, and also about your key moments of pride and achievements, as well as the challenges.
You know, as someone who studies transitions, I think part of it is we tend to study things that are important to us. That's the beauty of academia. Given a canvas to paint on, what are the things that spark interest and where are the things that don't necessarily make sense to the academic world as it stands? You know, my life is one of transitions. When you talk about design or serendipity, one of my big challenges is that I'm strategy writ broad. So when you think about my academic degrees even, that's the result of being someone who absolutely loves and is passionate about business. I grew up within a family business, so I saw the importance of business and the human side of business very, very early on. And so that has formed kind of this trajectory and path of who am I and how do I understand the world is we are humans in organizations. And how we act within those organizations and how we transition across those organizations and how we treat people within those organizations is so very important. One of my big challenges was at the end of my undergraduate, I took this new venture planning course. And we were supposed to write a business plan for our lives. And I didn't have one. I had a bucket list. You know, I want to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And the professor was very concerned. They said, you know, Sarah, you're going to be an absolute failure if you're not able to get this business plan down. But at the same time, I never was able to. But having my career develop, you know, there are these strategic guidelines of I wanted to be an academic. I had a mentor early on who said, you know, you need to go into academia. That's where your brain is. That's how your brain works. And he was right. But having the ability to embrace serendipity and take advantage of opportunities as they unfold, I think has led to a richer career trajectory, even if it's not one that is incredibly vanilla, as we would say.
I love that. I love the fact that you had this background scenery of thinking about humans in organizations and people in their trajectories of life and work, and then gave yourself, however much it might have been pointed out as a flaw, the opportunity to not be planful. I hate that word, but I think it's become a word in a dictionary.
Well, it wasn't something that was easy. You're coming out and you're saying, oh no, I'm supposed to have a plan for my life. You're 22, 23 and saying, I've got a long career trajectory ahead of me and I'm not quite sure how this is going to develop. But I think that's for the majority of people, right? And so much of what careers are these moments of opportunity or moments of failure that you end up crafting in function of those to grow.
Absolutely. that theory that at 23 we should be able to plan out our whole lives is disproven again and again and again and again. And, I get clients coming to me for coaching or some sort of advice on a career transition they want to make or have made when they're 55 or 65 and they've still got it wrong. So why on earth we should think that 20-somethings have the wisdom with which to build a cogent and infallible plan, I really don't know. But it's not a bad idea to give people the expertise, I guess.
It's not. It's a wonderful aspiration, right? And that could potentially keep you within a certain guide rails of not going completely off into,
I'm not sure what statistics say about the people who stay within that narrow plan, but I suspect the number is very low. So you've gone on and you've crafted this career within mostly academic institutions, some of them very well-known, very august. And I'm wondering what lessons you've learned as you've worked alongside other academics in that jostling for attention that is inherent in your sort of career. What sort of lessons have you learned as a human and as a thinker, as well as a leader?
I've been very, very fortunate to have mentors who were willing and able to guide me in what I was attempting to do, able to guide a person who didn't necessarily see the larger vision. I am a first-generation PhD in my family. And so even the PhD application process was a puzzle for me. I took 2 years visiting institutions to figure out what I actually wanted to study. Fortunately, I had the resources and a partner who was willing to back that and say, well, you have to figure this out, right? But that's been one thing, is that I tend to do my research. And as an academic, that turns out to be a very useful thing. And so I've never been a person who has jostled for attention. I tend to be head down and I do my work. Sometimes this is to my detriment. And this is, we know within gendered careers, gendered career paths, women tend not to toot their own horn. But what I have learned is that if you figure out your unique value proposition, in my case, I'm diagnosed as what they term highly functional ASD. And so this is what they used to call Asperger's, right? I've spent my entire life studying humans to figure out, how do these people work? Yeah. But at the same time, understanding that actually adds value in my capability to go through massive amounts of information and find patterns. That's one of my key value propositions, is I can take a 400 article literature review is exciting for me in a way that it probably isn't to other people.
It makes my eyes roll backwards. But
but these sorts of things, that's what, yes, you as a human, what are your deficits and how do you find people who can work alongside you to help you with those deficits? But also, what are your value propositions that you could potentially really help other people in collaborations? And when are there times where you're just much more efficient working alone? And that's okay. That's the beauty, at least in academia, in saying I have to produce scientific publications. When is it worthwhile to collaborate? When do I add value? When do other people help add value to a team? And when can I get this done really quickly by myself?
That sounds beautiful and a whole lot more collaborative than some of the academics that come on here and talk with me. But if you can make that work, fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about, what it would be like for a young person embarking on the beginning of their career to consider a full-blown career in academia. What sort of advice would you have for such a person?
So I think it depends in large part from where they're starting. So often, especially in business academia, well, in all academia now, it almost needs to be a career path that's determined from undergraduate. And that sounds surprising, but with the shift of business schools towards scientific institutions, it's becoming more common. So you see people now who are doing pre-docs, right? So they take a gap year after their undergraduate to be able to work on research and start the publishing process. I work with undergraduate students who are in their third or fourth year who want to help me with my research projects as research assistant. just because that will give them a reference letter and experience to then be able to already be semi-trained for a PhD program. So I would say take on an academic career with caution, understanding what you're getting into. There's also a value proposition for the organizations that you're entering, the business schools or the academic institutions. A PhD is money from their pocket as an investment for your future career and the hopefully future reputation that you're going to give them as, in my case, an INSEAD graduate. And hopefully they're proud of me, right?
Sure they are. Sure they are.
But when you think about that, that's what the institution is looking for, because they're paying for space, professor's time, your research for 4, 5, 6 years sometimes. And what is the return on their investment? That's what they're looking at. And so the question is, are you willing to put in that investment? And as much as, we like to say, you get a PhD and then you do whatever you want with it, that's true. But it's a much more challenging career path to not go straight academic after a PhD. You can go into a practitioner side of things, but especially in business schools, that's a lot less common. In industrial organizational psychology, that's perfectly fine career path. But especially in business schools, it's challenging. And so, the question is, are you in it for the long term? Do you love research? I get most excited when I can dig into an organization and say, okay, what are the problems here? How do I understand them? And how do we create something that's generalizable to other business cases? That's exciting. But I also understand that the publications that I'm putting out are by and large publications for a niche community of scholars. I do enjoy writing HBRs. I do enjoy certainly doing podcasts, but that's another audience that is not the core, unfortunately, of a lot of what we do. And the importance is, one, being able to be at a level where you are publishing for that core academic audience. And it's a different sort of writing. It's a different sort of communication. Me with my political and corporate communication background, it's very, very different. But at the same time, how do you, as an academic, stay relevant for the real world? And how do you translate what you're doing to people who, larger society, that might actually care about what you're doing, or hopefully you're doing research that will make a difference?
I love the distinction you make between the two types of audience. Let's indeed talk about one of your HBR articles. You wrote an article on career transitions and identity. It re-examines the statistic that somewhere around half of all new hires fail in their roles with lack of fit being cited as a key reason. You argue that fit doesn't always stem from a fundamental incompatibility, but rather can come from a failure to complete the psychological transition from one identity to another. Tell us more about what you meant and what we should be learning from your thinking.
This was an instance of translation from academic to practitioner. This is my research on lingering identities, these cases where you transition role, but you keep an identity from the past. So you can think of people who have been service people in the military. All of a sudden they have to transition to civilian career and they say, I'm still a military person, right? How do I make that transition? Or what is very organic within organizations is, you start off in a function, say engineering, and you're really good at engineering, so you get promoted to management. Well, how do you manage if you're still an engineer, right? These sorts of dynamics. And so when you think about fit and you think about lingering identities, the really important thing is openness and flexibility. And that's a really, really tough thing. It's the question of, how do I strategically look at this new role? And are there things, whether it's the value, the meanings, or the enactment, that is somehow translatable across those roles? And so the question is, can the role be made to be a fit? Can I be made to be a fit? Can I transition some of that and still be functional? Or is there just simple incompatibility? And that's the worst case scenario. I tend to try to be a positive thinker. And so I try to say, okay, what are the things that can translate? And are there ways for me to say, I was an entrepreneur, for example, and if my venture failed and I'm now an employee, is there entrepreneurial thinking that I can bring into my new role, and feeling kind of bummed maybe about this venture failing. But on the other hand, maybe I'm providing this core value because a lot of employees won't be thinking bigger, more strategically. So that would be one instance. Another one of the populations that I've studied that's really core to my understanding of what transitions are trailing spouses. And there, the question is, maybe it's a role that you don't see as fits within yourself. You were a professional, all of a sudden you have this career gap. You're hoping to get back in. There, you don't necessarily want that role to be a fit for you. You want to do it as well as you need to do. For example, in a lot of cases, this is to support a spouse. Well, you want to be able to be supportive, but at the same time, you need to hang in and you need to keep yourself together and that career identity together to be able to roll that into another work role once that period is over, or even during that period. So it depends, right? There are roles that you don't want to adapt to, but there are roles that you can find some compatibilities. And especially in work roles, that's the ideal case.
So that positive thinking sounds like a very useful accoutrement to be carrying around with you when making these transitions. In another part of that same article, you talked about finding a role that's a good enough fit for your identity. And I can see that that's already part of what you've been describing, but it also sounds like nirvana, right? If we could each, every single time we make a transition, find a good enough fit for our identity, we'd probably change career a lot less often, actually, unless forced to by geography. But what should we be doing to look for that good enough fit? What sort of due diligence and research should be happening for that sort of outcome to have a good chance of coming into being?
So when I say good enough fit, it's, can I be flexible? How far is too far for me? Or are there ways, as I was discussing before, that maybe I might be able to tweak how I'm thinking in order to make this work for me? And obviously, in order to make it work for the organization. And so really, it's a matter, at least in my mind, in that article, I introduce, this values, meanings, and enactment framework, saying, what of those is absolutely core to who you are? Is it the sense of value? Do you need self-esteem from this role? For some people, their work role is absolutely their lives. For other people, it's, I'm doing this to provide for my family. And so as long as there's a paycheck involved, I can adapt. What about the meanings? Are there meanings that might be able to translate? There's the case of the entrepreneur. What if I took my entrepreneurial mindset? I still can feel like an entrepreneur. Maybe I'm being entrepreneurial in creating a whole new client pool for my organization. That's a case where I can translate this. Or the enactment. Do I need absolutely to have my own office? Does that make it so that I am feeling like a professional? Are the spaces or the behaviors, are there any things about those or the relationships that are common across that you can draw on to say, okay, this isn't that far away from who I feel that I am? What are the compatibilities? Is it easy? Absolutely not. As humans, especially when we're in times of uncertainty and especially when we're feeling threatened, we tend to dig in to who we are, who we have been, and we say, change is bad. And so this really is a growth mindset in saying, how do we create those threads of commonality from past to present and potentially through to future that enable us really to stay sane and human and functional? And this goes to, the aspect of, what is a sustainable career? How do I create these pathways to be healthy, happy, and productive in this work role? And I think lingering identities really is one key part of that. In terms of due diligence and research, one of the interesting things when you think about job interviews, once you finally get in front of a person, after all of the algorithms have magically said that you could be a fit for the role, you tend to have this little bit of time where you can ask questions. And usually we're afraid to do that. Usually we think, and rightfully so, that the time to ask questions is their test of if we're going to ask intelligent enough questions. That's the reality. They're saying, did they do their homework? Do they know about our organization? Are they asking the right questions to make us hire them? But within that space, organizations want people who are going to be functional. They don't hire people setting them up for failure normally, right? And so they're wanting for you to have the amount of information that you need in order to know if this is a potential fit. And so that space within those interviews is really a time to dig into some of those questions. First, you have to understand your VMEs, and you need to know what are the little threads that I can draw on. But then after that, when you're in a conversation with people, that's actually going to make you seem a lot more astute, I would argue, because you're asking questions that are, how do I link what I've done before to what I'm going to be doing now, in the interest of myself, but also in the interest of the organization.
Indeed. I like that. Antoine and I are shortly going to be writing an article about what goes wrong, or sometimes not, when people don't do enough due diligence, more specifically with regard to culture than necessarily function and skills. And we've got some sizzling interviews coming up on that one.
Oh, I'll be excited to hear
the
about
bad
them.
and the ugly. Let's flip it a little bit and talk about your assertion that the Great Resignation is over, which is probably reasonable to agree with, and that we should be getting prepared for the big stay. I mean, all kinds of weird dynamics are going on at a macro level in the job market. But tell us more about this big stay thing.
I think the notion of the big stay really, it comes from environmental uncertainty. You know, as I was saying before, how people dig in when they feel uncertain. You look at the macroeconomic level, you look at, the uncertainty, you look at tech layoffs that are happening and layoffs in all sorts of other industries. What is the probability that as a professional, you're going to jump into the void at a great opportunity, but without necessarily a network to hold you, established relationships to guide you? And it may be a pay increase, but what happens with the next layoff?
Yes, quite simply being conservative and safety focused.
It is. Yeah, and you tend to see people, especially during times of uncertainty, act in this way. But the challenge is, obviously, if you're going to be staying, how do you create an environment, a relational environment, a human environment around you that enables you to continue contributing to the organization?
Absolutely.
But also, as an organizational manager, given that people are going to be more likely than not staying, how do you create an environment where when they end up having options, they're not going to be taking them? When we see on LinkedIn, it's often, at least here in the US, if you are in a job for a year, year and a half, and are any good at what you're doing or at a certain level, you're being headhunted. What is it that the organization can do then to make you say, no, that's fine, I'm okay? It's a big question for both the individual and the organization with respect to that.
Absolutely. Let's take our thinking then the step further and think about offboarding. Offboarding is something you've written about a lot, and it's something that is, I would say, most of the time messed up, probably by both the individual and the organization. What advice do you have for both parties as to how to handle an exit with grace and value?
With offboarding, so oftentimes it's viewed as a death. Quite frankly, it's
wrong statement.
You are
yes,
offboarded, you're laid off, you are fired, or maybe you're leaving, and all of a sudden you are the name that will not be mentioned, right? You are the person who has disappeared from an organizational standpoint. Or, if you do have the opportunity to have an exit interview, this is perfunctory. It's okay. Well, did you turn in your laptop? Did you turn in your keys? In large part, there is, a threat reaction on both parts. And so, maybe organizations, you don't want to hear as the manager what you did wrong if the person was leaving, right? And in that moment, there oftentimes are hotheads or sadness or all of these other emotions that inhibit a truly functional conversation from happening. And so I think if we could change that, if we could view it as much more graduation than a funeral, that would help us to understand what the reality of business is now. In an age of LinkedIn, the probability that you are, as an offboarded individual, retaining contacts with people in that organization is probably pretty high.
Indeed.
You know, just as you were contacted with the people in your previous organizations, with your alumni group in your university, et cetera, these business relationships are so much easier to retain when you're all connected on, you know, a social networking platform. And so given that you are still interacting human being with that network, organizations would be wise, and individuals too, to retain that network to the extent possible. And this is the case, you know, any industry that's up or out, consulting industries, for example, they actually have alumni groups.
They absolutely do. And they're extraordinary entities, yes.
They're extremely useful. And they feed into each other as clients or suppliers, or I have a friend who's looking for a job who would be fantastic
they're ambassadors,
for you.
They're recommenders. Yes, yes, yes.
It is. And you say, how do you capture that value? How do you normalize the fact that anyone is replaceable? You're replaceable, I'm replaceable. But as an organization, how do you normalize and say, given that this person is no longer with us, what value are they creating for someone else right now? And is there some sort of value that they're still providing us with, whether it's a friendship for an employee who's, you know, wondering about their place in our organization right now? So treating people as humans and not as these machine objects who do work within the organization.
There's a lot of room for big improvement in that area, but there are trailblazers. You're right.
But it's exciting. It's exciting from a human standpoint, but also from an academic standpoint, to understand, you know, what is this lifetime of a person's career and their interactions with different organizations over time. And if organizations and managers and even people who are having career are cued in on that and say, change is normal, people leaving and coming and going and all of these things is normal, then how do we start to humanize the organization and function of that flux?
Indeed. Well, we will expect many more articles on this subject from... Let's go back to 18-year-old Sarah. If you could go back to her now and give her your best piece of advice, what would it be?
Probably to chill out. You know, I've always been a list maker, right? I've always been a person who's, you know, said, how do we get from point A to point B? But I think embracing a little bit of the serendipity and saying, it's okay. Today's going to look a mess. Tomorrow maybe too. But in that mess making, there are patterns that in retrospect become clear. And so, you know, making it okay, and this is what I would encourage any young person to do, is say, it's okay to not have it all figured out. You know, I mean, my permanently 29-year-old self doesn't have it all figured out either. But I think I have a little bit more faith and experience to be able to say,
it's the experience, isn't it? You know, you probably won't be sleeping on a park bench if you make that decision without every single element of information in hand.
I think that's the case.
Yeah. And let's go on the other side. If you could change one thing about the world of work, what would it be?
I think so much of what is beautiful about organizations and what is challenging about organizations is the human side of things. What I would love is for people to treat each other as humans with understanding that we all have limitations. No one is super person forever and every single day. But understanding and respecting each other and saying that is a part of the human experience. If that weren't the case, we would all be robots, right? I mean, no one has that consistent of performance and upward trajectory, and it's just impossible. It does not happen. Even for the most upward trajectory. I mean, Steve Jobs was kicked out of his own company.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
and no tennis player stays consistently on the top all the time. Nobody is always
on, but say, is that human aspect something that we can respect and we can honor while also striving to do better? But looking at the trajectory and looking at the ability rather than do you give off this aura of our inevitability and all of these things. I think that's the key thing that I would change is how do we treat each other as humans? How do you as a manager be vulnerable enough to show that pathway to your subordinates, but also accept that sometimes they're going to be vulnerable? And, do you ding them for them? Does that give a bad performance review? All of these things. This is magic wand land, Claire.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't have all the answers in this.
It's magic wand land, but if we don't get there, then we're going to be in even more trouble than we're in now. I think that's worth
I think you're right.
putting on the table, very definitely. This is the focus of all my work these days, making more humans out of leaders. And it's not something they're very good at because interests are vested in not changing and grasping to whatever power they have.
Yes. I think COVID really is COVID a thing of the past. It seems like that's void of these 3 years that sort of the world just disappeared, right?
Yeah.
But I think if COVID gave us anything, it was this beautiful opportunity to rethink who we are in the workplace, how work is done. And, oh my gosh, that people might end up with health challenges or all of these other things that mean that human side needs to take priority sometimes. So not to mention children going to school virtually and these other things, trying to manage work life.
There's been plenty of range in terms of the things bringing us to vulnerability. But I would also argue that it's not just about the negative things that we need to be vulnerable. It's about being willing to ask for help, admit that we don't know, look for support and opportunity and innovation beyond the things that we can control and do it together. That's where it's really exciting.
I think that's what, with collaboration, academic collaboration, even industrial collaboration, that's really been the core of it is I have these capabilities and these capabilities are pretty, they're pretty home. But if we can be even more powerful together, more functional together, more productive together. That's the essence of organizing, right, Claire? People doing things together to achieve some common objective.
Absolutely. Yeah. My current leadership theory, and I don't think it's going to change from now on, is that organizations are a bunch of humans making and selling products or services for humans with other humans in the aim of creating value for humans, period. That's it. Just be nice to each other and it might work.
Yes.
Easier said than done. Sarah, what other articles or projects or excitements should we be looking out for from you over the next year?
So actually align with what you're saying in terms of ability, humanity. I'm on a multidisciplinary project looking at how to empower neurodiverse workers to enter and thrive in the workplace using technology. And so a colleague of mine in engineering and I were just granted $1.87 million by the National Science Foundation to explore this space. And it is so exciting because it's led me into, I've always been passionate about these more challenging transitions, right? Whether it's the trailing spouses, whether it's, high-performing leaders coming off and retiring, all of these other things. But here, with disability and in line with that is neurodiversity, there's this core of what does it mean to have an ability? And so oftentimes our workplaces are defined by, do you have the appropriate ability? But the question is, how do we extend our thinking? How do we craft jobs around tasks rather than roles to make organizations more inclusive so that other people can transition in and have careers, people who have been traditionally overlooked? And so this is really the vision of that project. That's one of the most exciting things that I have on my plate. And obviously, with that sort of money and that sort of scope, it's taking a lot of my time.
That's fantastic. And actually, just to note, Antoine and I wrote an article about a series of stories of neurodiverse people whose careers were succeeding, probably getting on for 10 years ago now.
Oh my goodness.
Which I'm not going to make you cite as your number one piece of research, but know that we were already thinking about it. And of course, some organizations were doing what they could to make things happen well a long time ago too. But I'm delighted, as I'm sure Antoine will be, to hear that you're going to be tackling this in a systematic and positive way. That's wonderful.
It opens the scope for all sorts of conversations about what are careers. We're studying a lot of the organizations, they have special groups who are targeted at people like me, people who need their shoelaces tied in a certain way, and then they are the best coders you will ever see. What we're looking at are people who, they want a livable wage. They want to be able to contribute to themselves, their families, and society. How do we use technology in a way that is driven by them, for them, and with them? But it opens up the question of ethical uses of technology and things like this. So anyway, that's where it's going.
Well, we will get you back on when you've progressed with that, especially if you write a book or an article. We love to get people back to talk about specific bits of their research and their thinking. So that's wonderful, Sarah. Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast today. Thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground and it's been fascinating. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's really been a pleasure, and I'll look forward to hearing more about what you all are up to.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.